Welcome to the next episode of our Mental Health and Wellbeing in COVID-19 webinar series. You can see I put in the title here today, In and After COVID-19. We chatted in the previous episode about the fact that the world is going to change, and in fact, who we become during this time is who we take into the new world. We chatted a little bit about the power of the imagination and how we're going to need that. We're going to need to unlock that to be able to play our part in shaping the world that is coming and being able to flourish in that world. Anyway, today marks the first episode in our reimagined webinar series, Mental Health and Wellbeing in COVID-19 2.0. Now, the reason we've reimagined this is because the lockdown got extended. As we mentioned in the previous 2 episodes, I think, we had committed to a 3-week journey to walk with you during lockdown. Lockdown became 5 weeks. So we have continued that commitment and we are walking with you. But we've had to reimagine it a little bit because it was a little bit unsustainable. And who knows if there's going to be a lockdown 3.0. So we're just trying to make sure that what it is we deliver to you, we can keep delivering. And that's taken a little bit of reimagining. We've had to be flexible. We've had to adapt. And that's actually what the theme of today's webinar is. Flexibility. It is an emotional intelligence skill, and we're going to spend a little bit of time speaking about it today. In this reimagined webinar series, we've trimmed things down. As I mentioned before, we're not going to do a half-hour webinar each day. Probably 10, 15, 20 minutes. Might be different here and there. We'll have to see how we go. But there's going to be some new rules. Mark's trying to run the company. I'm running the webinar. Okay, so as I said, you'll see me each day. I think we'll get him on here and there. In fact, today you'll see a little bit of a clip from one of our Mygrow videos that our users look at each day. So you'll still get your Mark Baker fix today. Okay, so what are the other dynamics that we can expect here? Okay, we're going to still be getting guests. Not a guest every day, I'm sure. And when we do, it'll just be me chatting to them. In fact, probably the bulk of the episode will just be the conversation, the interview with me and that person. We're going to be doing some EQ techniques. We have chatted and we have run you through a couple of different techniques in the previous episodes, but we're actually going to do some here. Like you and me, we're going to do some techniques in the webinar. And when I have guests, I think I'm going to do some techniques with the guests as well. Okay, so that's what you can expect. It's slightly different. We're still going to carry on. It's still going to offer great value. So please stick with us. We're going to stick with you. Please stick with us. All right, today, what are we looking at today? Flexibility. As I mentioned, it is an emotional intelligence skill. The place where it fits in the larger construct, specifically the construct we use at Mygrow, the EQI 2.0, is that flexibility is a sub-skill or a sub-competency of stress management. One of the ways that we can handle stress well is to be flexible. Now, the reason we're looking at flexibility today is because we've had to think through how we can be flexible and adapt to the changed circumstances. We were all expecting to be back at work today, but our office is still sitting empty, and here I am in my home office again, just like you are in the same context you were last week, even though your expectations were different. In times like that, it calls for flexibility. And that's what we've had to do. We've had to be flexible around this webinar, but you yourselves are going to need or have needed to be flexible in a whole new set of circumstances and dynamics. If you can develop the skill, if you can grow this muscle, it will help you in this time. Not just in this time, but heading into a new world as we get there. Okay, before I go any further, well, first of all, let me just say, when I talk about flexibility, I'm not talking about your body and being supple and, yoga. We're not talking about that. We're talking about an actual skill that is in your mind, in your emotional centers, that helps you to adapt to different circumstances. But let me not tell you too much more about it. I'm going to show you a clip from Droplet 17 of our stress management module. Mark basically just explained to us what flexibility is, and then we'll pick up the conversation after that.
In terms of EQ, flexibility is the ability to adapt emotions, thoughts, and behaviors to unfamiliar, unpredictable, and dynamic circumstances or ideas. Now, I find it helpful to actually think of this as psychological flexibility. It's not just one process, but a number of dynamic processes that unfold over time. In later courses, we'll dive into more detail on these processes, but essentially there are 4 that make up flexibility. Adapting to fluctuating situational demands, reconfiguring mental resources, shifting your perspective, and balancing competing desires, needs, and life domains. So, why is flexibility important for stress management? A big part of managing stress is being able to handle things that we aren't prepared for, things that are out of our control. We need flexibility to roll with the punches, to adapt, to shift, to adjust our course and adopt effective coping strategies. Research has shown that psychological flexibility can actually be even more significant in helping people manage stress than specific styles or strategies of coping. For example, in a daily diary study, when people monitored stressful life events, coping strategies, and whether those coping strategies were successful, it was found that 30% of people demonstrating coping flexibility were better adjusted on a daily basis and showed less anxiety and depressive symptoms over a 1-week period than people that showed a strict adherence to a specific strategy, be it problem or emotion-focused coping. So instead of just picking one technique, like the ABCDE technique to manage your emotions, or using exercise to manage stress, as you carry on with Mygrow and learn more and more EQ techniques, you'll be able to have more and more ways of dealing with the changing environment around you. And part of that is the power of emotional intelligence. Beyond just managing stress, psychological flexibility has been shown to make a major contribution to well-being and lasting psychological health, even those with mental health disorders. For example, in a clinical trial of social anxiety disorder, greater changes in flexibility during the early phases of treatment were associated with less distress and impairment during later sessions. Now, you'll remember that positive emotions have a huge impact on increasing our flexibility because they help us to see more options.
Okay, Mark, we're going to pause you right there. So clearly we can see from the research, from everything Mark's sharing, that flexibility is important. It's a really powerful skill to have. So why is it needed for now and for the new future? That's a silly question. We all know the answer. Let me just walk us through some of the dynamics. So the world has shifted, as you know. And on this shifting expectation, where we're hearing different things each week from the Reserve Bank and from our employers and from the news and from our friends, we don't yet know where the world is going to settle. We don't know what the new normal will look like. All we know is the current normal is a little bit up in the air. So it's very clearly, I think, understandable that flexibility, being able to adapt to things, is a vital skill for us to have. Now, Dr. Susan David is a professor at Harvard. She's actually South African, so that's really cool. But she's a professor at Harvard, and she's coined this term, emotional agility. Now, it's very similar, but if you just take that idea of agility, it's not the same thing, but it's very similar to this EQ skill of flexibility. Now, she talks about emotional agility a lot. In fact, I was just listening to an episode of hers recently from a podcast she does called Checking In with Susan David, and that's partly where I'm going to be drawing some of this information from. So if it interests you, please go check it out. She says the opposite of agility is rigidity. Rigidity being rigid, being stuck. And she says this is characterized by being hooked on negative thoughts, negative behavior patterns, and negative stories. We've talked a lot about the stories that we believe, the subconscious identities, the narratives that play out in our lives, and the roles of the characters that we play in them. Being a creator or a victim, I won't even go into it. Go back and look at the previous webinars. Anyway, she says we get hooked on some of these unhelpful stories. In our terms, in Mygrow's language, we get hooked on these negative subconscious identities. And she said that we need to unhook. The art of emotional agility is the ability to unhook from unhelpful stories. So what does she mean by stories? Okay. One of the examples she gives of a story could be this. You believe about yourself that you can only get things done if you have long chunks of uninterrupted time. Well, you no longer have that. You're trying to work from home. In my case, with 3 kids just out there listening watching TV and a wife who's also trying to juggle multiple different things. None of us are getting long chunks of time anymore. The only way to do that is in the middle of the night, but that's not sustainable. So if we've believed the story that we're not going to get anything done unless we have long chunks of time, well, then we're in a bit of trouble right now because the circumstances have shifted. The dynamics have changed. And if we can't be flexible, if we can't be agile and unhook ourselves from that story, it's only going to cause frustration, irritation, relational damage, etc., etc., etc. Downward negative spirals, essentially. Another example she gives is maybe you believe the only way you can deal with stress is in a kickboxing ring. You go every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday night to kickboxing. Well, you can't do that anymore because even if you're wearing your mask, you're not allowed to go to kickboxing. So how do you unhook from that story? If you've believed the only way I can handle stress is to do that or to go for a run every evening, well, you can't do that. The context has shifted, and we need to be, in her words, agile, or in the general terms of emotional intelligence, we need to be flexible to be able to adapt to new circumstances and situations. If we believe that old story, there's going to be problems for us. The story doesn't work anymore. How do we unhook? Okay, so she has a couple of different tips, different techniques we can do to do that. Her first one, and I think it's primary, she says we need to embrace the moment. It sounds simple. It sounds quite intuitive, but we don't embrace the moment. I think our default is to say, oh, what am I going to do? I've got to get these hours. I've got to get long interrupted hours, chunks of time to get anything done. We try and protect the old stories instead of embracing the moment. And we've chatted a little bit about mindfulness as a concept or as a practice that says, mindfulness says I'm going to be present with what is right now. The practice of mindfulness is very similar to embracing the moment. That's step one. Step two, have a laugh. Try and distance yourself a little bit to be able to see what is funny about this moment. There's a lot that's funny about the moment. We're not going to look at that in too much more detail right now because tomorrow's guest is Skulk Bezedenote, the comedian. If you haven't heard about him, I think I already said. Anyway, he's going to be on tomorrow. So we're going to be unpacking humor and the positive effect of humor in tomorrow's episode. So don't miss that. When I say tomorrow, that's obviously only if you're watching it live. If you're catching the replays, don't stop watching now to go to that one. Keep watching this one. Okay. All right. So have a laugh. And number three, she said, change your point of view. She says she often works with clients who come to her office and they have, they can't see any options. You may remember us speaking about the thought action repertoire, how negative emotion limits the options we see of actions that we can take. We have fewer thoughts of actions in our repertoire that we can do to overcome something. And she says these clients come in and they say, I can't, there's nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do. And she says, well, have you thought of any options? She says, no, I can't think of any options. That's why I'm here. And she says, in those moments, what she likes to do with them is to take them through an exercise to help them change their point of view. Because if they can change their point of view, they will start generating some options. And she says, okay, think of a friend or think of someone in your life. And if they were in the room right now, what advice would they give you about your current situation? And she says it's phenomenal how often, just by putting yourself in someone else's shoes and imagining them looking in to your situation, she says it's amazing. They come up with solutions. They come up with advice that their friends would give them. So she really advocates for this practice of trying to change your point of view. If you are struggling at the moment with a certain set of dynamics, change your point of view. Think of the wisest person in your life and imagine what would they suggest. And you may be surprised at what solutions and options bubble to the surface for you. Okay, fourthly, habits. Now this is a big one. She says when our habits shift, when our habits change, for instance, if you take my life, for example, up until 3 weeks ago, my habit was wake up every morning, 6:30, get breakfast for the kids, do a bit of yoga, get myself ready for the day, make sure the kids' bags are packed, take the boys to school, get to the office around about 8 o'clock. Same thing every day. Sure, my days may look different, but I've got management meetings on this day. I got meetings with my team on that day. There's a schedule that I understand. I live in a routine. I have habits. Well, now, since lockdown, All that stuff is out the window. Nobody's going to school. Nobody's even getting out of their pajamas. Okay, you can see I'm out of my pajamas, but the kids aren't out of their pajamas. Everything's out the window. Now, she says when your habits go out the window, when your routines go out the window, what happens is fear and anxiety sort of creep into that space. We start lashing out. We start ruminating. We've chatted about the negative effects of ruminating. We start catastrophizing. I'm going to lose my job. The whole world's going to end, etc., etc., etc. And that's not helpful. That's not helpful. It's not a helpful way to respond when the dynamics shift. No, we need to figure out how to adapt. So now we get to the meat of her practical advice here. She says, when habits and things like that have shifted because of things outside of our control, try to focus on what is in your control. What can you create as a routine? How can you make sure that you are actually in control of your day? Well, you can take charge of what you're eating. You can be in control of some kind of exercise program. You can take charge of your sleep and make sure that you're getting enough of it. And she said you need to recreate, or should I say, create new structures, new habits to help you sort of combat some of that negative emotion and that rumination and catastrophizing and relational damage that's going to come from lashing out. So that's essentially what she recommends. Those 4 things: embrace the moment, have a laugh, try and change your point of view, and create new habits within your control. That's pretty much it for today. I'm going to sign off in a second. The next episode, we're going to be exploring, as I said, that second piece of advice she gives, have a laugh. We're going to be exploring that in the next episode and looking at some of the research around the positive effect and positive emotion and things like laughter and what that can do for us. And as I said, we're going to be having a chat with Skulk Bezedno, so don't miss that one. Now, you may be alone going through this. You may be with others, but we're all in this together. One of the things I love about how Susan David says this is, we're all in this differently. Well, one thing is for sure, the world is different, the current moment is different, and if we're going to thrive and flourish into it, we need to be different too. I'll see you in the next episode.